I'm Amanda Cassett, and you're watching Endgame.
One in every 31 site visits was conducted by a non-human actor, which is up precipitously from 1 in 200 just earlier last year. And so more and more of us are experiencing the web through the lens of our digital butlers, our AI-enabled assistants. However, we are simply passing on the responsibility of identification to those agents. And so in order to access spaces that are gated for adults only, in order to be able to facilitate payment, to be able to enable, access to, for example, government services that require you to identify yourselves, we are saddling our agents with a need to be able to prove who they're acting on behalf of if we want to be able to moderate the same types of experiences we could have in a more manual or old school way logging into everything. And so now I think we've moved beyond the era of simply KYC to what we're calling KYA, or Know Your Agent. The ability to confer a unique identity upon an instance of an AI agent and to allow it to inherit or prove who it's acting on behalf of and their traits and capabilities.
That's really more of the use case than escaping the inshitification, because we've already burrowed ourselves away from the inshitified experience. And so it's really just about pairing the person with the agent. What is identity and what's wrong with how it works right now on the internet?
So when I think about identity from a philosophical, factual perspective, sometimes people will describe it as what is remembered or left behind when you leave the room. But from a technical perspective, I think of identity as an identifier. So a series of numbers and letters, characters that you are known by. So it could be a government name, a public key, a nickname, plus some data that describes what you've been up to or your traits or your attributes. So an identifier plus metadata and the ability to sign on behalf of that identifier, to embody or prove that you control it, to affirm, the traits about it through action. And so in the crypto space, we often see that as a public-private key pair and attributable data that describes that public key. But there are, a number of challenges with the way that we use the term identity, both in the crypto native space and more broadly, because it is a very personal concept, right? Your identity as a human is expressed in so many different ways in so many different spaces. And it has now become synonymous in the technical space with simply an identifier, not necessarily with signing capabilities or with associated metadata. And I think that is too simplistic, too single faceted.
So let's zoom out for a moment and make this kind of a Dora the Explorer level conversation, at least to begin with. So a lot of people feel that there's something wrong with the way that Facebook and Google handle identity, and they wish it was done in some different way. What's up with that? Is that what you think too? Is that what's broken? What do people think is broken? What's really broken? How is identity done wrong on the web?
So identity is done wrong on the web because it was forgotten or not deliberately crafted in the earliest forms. The internet as we know it today is a great messaging network intended for computers to communicate with one another, but missing a layer that identifies and includes human beings. And so for most of my connected life, my experience with applications and websites and services has been one of being harvested, where I express actions and data on websites like Facebook or environments curated by companies like Google. And then those businesses trade secrets or data that they collect about me behind my back through the exchange of APIs and centralized databases. And so without a signing key pair, without the ability to assert myself as an equal participant in this network to the computers that are able to communicate, I am simply a producer of data to be consumed by the enterprises and machinery around me, instead of equipped with a signing key to be able to express and assert myself.
It sounds very reductive. It sounds like an extractive relationship. And you hear this a lot, especially in the early kind of crypto Web3 space. The idea of identity connected with the idea of data, like own your own data, control your own data. But what's happened is no one really does and no one really cares, right? So like if you look at how valuable your actual data is that you've ever produced on Facebook or on Instagram. And let's say you owned that and you owned that value. What would it be like $300, $500 a year?
Generously.
Generously, right? And so it's not actually very valuable. And so the idea that you would own it, I think that concept has kind of been like debunked and doesn't really mean anything. And no one's even like really trying to own it and they wouldn't know what to do if they did. So I guess like if the problem with identity is that you don't own your own data, that's the problem.
So I think I would challenge that framing a little bit because there is no mechanism by which you can collect, observe, or interact with your data before it is funneled directly into the hands of the controllers of the digital environment where you exist. There is no liminal space between the creation of data and the forfeiture of that data over to the platform that you're using. And so you are feeding directly into those one-way pipes, one-way chutes into centralized databases. And so part of the reason our data has very little value is that it was not designed to be reviewed or considered outside of the context in which it was originally produced.
Okay, so you're producing all this data, it's being extracted from you, and you don't have right power over what gets emitted from you and collected. And if you were trying to monetize it by yourself, it wouldn't be very valuable. But somehow, when these big companies collect it, they're able to monetize it all together and sell it to advertisers. But now the advertising business model is going to go away because of AI. And so the problem solves itself.
So I think we've got a few steps in there, but we're creating some interesting new problems. So in the era of laws like GDPR and CCPA that enable citizens to make requests of these businesses to understand which of my data have you collected and how are you using it. In some cases, I wish for you to delete it. These, sometimes described as arduous requirements do not suit the one-way data machines that were originally designed.
So you're a GDPR fan.
So I am an interested spectator. I think that GDPR is sort of the consequence of a failure to consider some design principles that were originally introduced in 2005 by a guy named Kim Cameron at Microsoft. The 7 laws of identity. And these parameters were introduced as best practices for designing identity systems where the objective is to minimize risk and harm to their human participants. So I think the current setup, the sort of surveillance capitalism, as Shoshana Zuboff describes it, as well as this absence of a container or mechanism to associate data with an identifier, I think these principles, such as minimum disclosure, so limiting the need to know sharing of
Yeah.
data only to facilitate the transaction you're intending, or constrained use to specific parties. So leveraging access to data only to execute certain functions and not to overshare. I think the total, ignoring of these principles in the design of modern identity systems has led to an aggressive attempt to correct the harms of these systems, such as GDPR and CCPA. But I think they put an undue burden on small and medium-sized businesses who were not designed to curate sensitive data and to be able to extrapolate its prior use, but rather were websites to sell shoes or social platforms or having very different objectives. And so here we are reaching a strange impasse between the sort of demands that are placed on these businesses and the way that they've been allowed to evolve to this point.
So what should be done tangibly that's different from what's happening right now as far as identity? Like maybe you can walk us through a workflow that's normal to people about how identity is working right now versus in an ideal system and what could be put up in the way.
So today, when we visit websites or interact with new applications, for the most part, when we arrive at the beginning of the onboarding process, let's say a sign up or login page, it's almost as though it's our first day on the internet. And we spend a lot of time reintroducing ourselves by signing up to different services.
And shitification, right? Like this is what Cory Doctorow calls
Yes.
that. And, you're constantly logging in and out of things in order to give people your data. And it just makes the whole experience boring and shitty.
Totally. And we in the United States spend tens of millions of hours every year filling out forms, which also has its own set of challenges. Not only is the enshittification of the internet time consuming and dull, it also introduces ample opportunities for human error, which has its own, cost and complexity. But as we have to reintroduce ourselves to each new door we knock on in digital space, we are creating duplicate copies of our data that each of which introduces different risk surfaces for harm or for their inappropriate release. And so this process is obviously, arduous and inefficient, but what we should be doing instead is enabling users to bring their data with them from one place to another. You've already done 100 tasks today that prove that you're a human being. Why on earth would you have to fill out another CAPTCHA? And so I think what this kind of returns us to is a missing layer of connectivity that allows human beings to be identified in these networks, such that they may be the active transport layer for their own information from one site or application to another. Just by virtue of basic workload, this seems much more efficient, but previously was not feasible due to the technical and performance constraints of decentralized networks like blockchains or the lack of incentive to manage private keys with systems like PGP.
So let's say I am just starting my Spotify account and I don't have Spotify yet. And I have to set up my account. I have to add my name, my address, my email. I have to verify something when they send me an email. Maybe I have to put in my billing information. And that, let's say it takes 5 minutes. And I have to do that with every new thing. But you're saying I shouldn't have to spend those 5 minutes. And the moment I download the application, it should know who I am.
I think you should have the ability to introduce yourself with that very low barrier of participation. I think the concept of autofill for everything should be readily available to all users of the internet and the agents that serve them with a consent layer, the ability to decide what you want to share and when. We'll often sort of in the technical space call this selective disclosure.
Got it. So, I mean, I'm pretty much chill with disclosing my name and my email address, but not my phone number and definitely not my credit card information. So I could just say, it's chill to always disclose my name. This email that I send all my spam to, fine, send whatever you want there. But mostly, unless something's really sensitive, I won't give them my phone number. And only if it's this one type of thing, I'll give my credit card. Is that what this looks like?
I think that is exactly the user journey, the experience that we're working toward. So the ability to set defaults over how you wish to present yourself or introduce yourself in digital space. But of course, that requires a little bit of additional infrastructure and tooling for you to be able to define those preferences and carry them across sites.
And so, like, I love the idea of earning back all these little pieces of my life that I'm spending on random useless crap and not have these funny little joints between all my tasks. I want to just go from my listening to music to my shopping to my, my social media to my, reading a news site without all this funny, like, log in, log out stuff for sure. But don't you think that if those companies cared about my experience and my little shards of life, but they would have already implemented something like this? Like, what's the missing piece been?
Incentives. And so right now there is an economic incentive for data over collection because there not only is value in aggregate user data at great scale, but of course, there's always the question of, what if that data becomes useful later? And so, in the absence of minimum disclosure requirements or other forcing functions, there really is no incentive to optimize for user well being over potential future value. Now, we've seen with laws like GDPR, CCPA, and others that the additional cost of managing, securing, and interacting with computing on this data in accordance with that regulation has given pause to many businesses that now have to employ a few people simply to field those requests and respond to them. I think, one other unique challenge that we have here is that the incentive structures around design for identity systems or authentication systems are really only moved by kind of three things, I think. One of them is capital. Are you making money or saving money as a
Sure.
result of those design choices? I think another one is compliance. Are you going to get in trouble if you don't have these
Yeah.
capabilities and requirements, that's sort of leans kind of the GDPR direction. And then I think the third is dopamine. Is
Mm.
human inertia going to generate value or enable compliance, or have so much incentive that ignoring compliance might even be on the table?
I'll tell you this, that Shopify thing where it plugs in your credit card information instead of you're having to retype it every time. It has probably made at least me just buy more stuff, and because I don't get hung up on the credit card entry process and forget or decide I don't actually want it. And so I think the argument that a smoother identity experience makes people spend more money, I think that's kind of a no-brainer.
I completely agree. And, no one wakes up in the morning after having dreams of logging in.
Right.
That friction is, a
And it's not
tolerable
cool.
nuisance.
It makes the internet not cool.
Yeah,
We often talk about, like, can you imagine Lil Wayne like logging into an app? Like, you just can't imagine it. Wouldn't happen.
it is deeply uncool. And also,
You just can't see it.
yeah, oh my gosh, that I think, that's part of the reason that one of many people's favorite iOS features is the ability to autofill authentication codes that they've
And
received
then
via text
then
message.
you also get all the good biometric stuff. You're seeing that on Apple a lot, where you can just tap that biometric keypad and log into a lot of things.
So eliminating that friction of access, especially around financial transactions, I think allows for the freer pursuit of immediate dopamine, which in turn can have, great returns depending on the business and service. But this kind of tension in between optimal user experience and revenue, and then associated cost for data management, is getting into an interesting tangle as we increase the volume of that data, the labor that's required to discern and extract value from it, and then we sort of after the fact add on additional regulation and requirement to it.
I guess here's my question. I love that little thing where I can tap on my computer with my pad of my finger, and not enter anything. And I love a passkey where it just kind of enters everything and I don't know how it works and it just takes me to the site that I was going to. And I like that kind of fast checkout and where it enters all your credit card information in there. Maybe you press one key to approve it doing that. Why do we need crypto? Why do we need the blockchain for this? Seems like we're kind of trying to get ourselves through it even without.
So, in order to enjoy those experiences that you've described, you're sort of
I wouldn't say
set,
I
yeah,
enjoy
or
them, but they certainly make life better.
yeah,
Or
maybe
fix the problem that was the arbitrary problem that was created.
benefit from them,
Yeah,
let's say, or to take advantage of
sure.
those opportunities of swifter process.
Mm.
Those can only occur inside of wholly owned environments
Right.
or walled gardens. And so that one click approval is not available on every website, only those that are enabled with Shopify checkout or similar service.
But if you're using a crypto thing, wouldn't they all have to agree that to use the crypto thing?
So front ends, I think, will always be, controlled by those who present them. And
Sure.
so usage turns specs into standards. And so the standardization of such a layer, I think, will inform its ubiquity. But I was actually thinking of something a little bit differently in terms of why crypto, like cryptography, is valuable here. Because in order for you to benefit from those smoother experiences beyond where Shopify has individually declared it shall be so, you need a data backpack. You need a
Sure.
container for that information that you wish to autofill into everything. And without a signing key, without a mechanism to take custody of data written about yourself, those preferences that you want to carry around, and to be able to approve its deployment, you may need to exit the Shopify walled garden because you want to interact with a different website, even though you may be sharing the same information.
Okay. So just to be really clear, you can imagine a world in which I have a cryptography protected data backpack that I bring with me to every site I visit that doesn't require that site to opt in to enable me to then dump that backpack out on that site with maybe the click of a finger. Is that right?
There are certainly ways to make it easier and smoother with the opt-in and intentional design of those sites. But I think the breadth of where you can carry that data is no longer limited by a single company's incentives, but rather can be made available and open. I also think that in terms of the benefits of crypto and decentralized technology, we can carry this data across boundaries where businesses are not allowed to move it today. So, for example, many countries have data expatriation laws
Mm,
that allow or that disallow businesses from physically moving data about you from one nation state to another across national boundaries or from one business unit to another. In fact, this can even be prohibitive within holding companies or groups of businesses that have the same owners, where they can't share data between different divisions or different entities because of these laws.
mhm.
However, you, because you created the data, it's written about you, a copy of it can belong to you. You can carry information about yourself wherever you would like. And so this can also lessen the compliance complexity or opportunities for human error in creating redundant copies of that data and allow it to actually save time and money for the business's benefit.
And so, what does this look like in practice? I show up at Spotify, and instead of entering all this stuff, I do what?
I think, you can imagine it's very similar to the experience of autofill. I think it is entirely feasible. And we've already seen, early examples of this enabled with cryptographic keys for you to click a few buttons and to be able to autofill that data and those preferences. So, for example, with Billions Network and our team, we make it possible for you to prove to multiple applications without having to recreate data, things like the fact that you're over the age of 18 without revealing your underlying date of birth,
Mhm.
or to prove that you are a human being and not a bot, to multiple apps without having to recreate the same evidence for each one.
And so this is what WorldCoin are doing also, this proving you're human. And it's what we do every day with things like CAPTCHA. Why all this focus on proving you're human? Why do so many companies think that's an important thing to do? And I can make an argument for why it wouldn't be, which is, everyone's money is the same. And if a bunch of agents are going to hold a bunch of, credit card numbers and permission to use them, or some bank account access, or some crypto or stable coins that they're deploying, who cares whether something's a person or a machine?
So right now, I think the most pressing reason to differentiate is that the absence of the ability to do so is getting really expensive. So in the United States alone last year, more than $1.1 billion were lost to deepfake scams, and we're anticipating that that's going to exceed $40 billion by next year.
Yeah, but there used to also be like the Nigerian prince email scams, and now there's not as much of that because people have wised up.
That's true. So let's talk about agents and sort of the other costs that are implied here. Often called the original sin of the internet, play advertising is going away, or will certainly be diminished as agents browsing
Sure.
sites are not swayed by the beautiful display ads on the sides of different
No
sites.
mimetic desire for them.
Exactly, or at least not right now. And so the absence of such a business model continuing to be performant when you have agents browsing on your behalf means that there are other ways in which we can interact or prove usership instead of wasting money to display signs to unwilling and uninterested participants. However, some of the scenarios you described earlier, being able to grant payment permissions to an agent on your behalf or allowing it to seek information on your behalf, I think that is also where identity plays a role. So the concept of the personal agent, the digital butler, is predicated on the assumption that that agent can prove who it is acting on behalf of. So, for example, agentic payments are blocked until we can discern who exactly we are paying or receiving payment from. And this is also where compliance requirements come into
Right.
play.
As if it's illegal, you want to hold someone accountable, and you can't hold an agent accountable. Pair up the person with the agent so that you can hold the person accountable if the agent does something wrong.
Exactly. But in addition to that, you want to be able
So
to
for
pair.
blame.
So for blame, but also for enablement. So I want to be able to prove that my agent is acting on behalf of my credit card that I control. I want to be able to prove that my agent is acting on behalf of, let's say, a person who is not on the OFAC list, and thus it is able to interact and freely in certain spaces that might be regulated. So I think that the existence of blame or absence of it is a sort of set of guardrails that agents will need to start following. Because in absence of that, we are, entirely responsible for all actions of the agents that we deploy or that we offer.
Very interesting. I was hoping that KYC wouldn't follow us into the agentic era, but it seems it is.
So I have a little bit of beef with the term KYC because I think it often is conflated with any interaction that requires a step beyond total anonymity. So KYC in the way that we think about it, a Billions Network is a legal definition, the collection of specific information about a person and the retention of that data in a centralized way or centrally accessible way for a given period of time, in some jurisdictions up to 7 years, such that it can be accessed by law enforcement in the event of an investigation or violation. However, there are many different ways to be able to identify an individual or a user that do not require this arduous legal process. We were chatting earlier about our colleagues over at World. I think there are basically three ways to identify a unique human being that don't require full legal KYC and all of this complexity.
Okay.
Firstly, you can just have a list, and so governments typically manage these centralized lists, things like passports or driver's licenses. But if that list is incomplete, if all participants in the population are not included, then it can have some limitations. Also, if that list is not recognized or readily accessible in the spaces where these individuals are engaging, such as on chain or in another country. So we've got lists. Secondly, we have soft tissue biometrics. So things like your irises, like your fingerprints.
That sounds like World.
They do. They use soft tissue biometrics as the basis for their identity. And then thirdly, we have what's sort of referred to as the web of trust, or a combination of lists of traits and capabilities that can include soft tissue biometrics or even patterns of interaction.
What about like social consent?
Yes, so that can absolutely be included in a web of trust model. There are also,
These people all say you're this person.
yes, these people all say you're this person, or the footprint of your actions would be so costly to recreate by others and is so disparate from others that it is highly unlikely that you are indeed embodied in the same person. And so we call that cost of recreating your footprint as the cost of counterfeit.
Yeah.
So when the cost of counterfeit exceeds the cost of production, that's sort of when we can get a clearer assessment. However, the web of trust model requires a lot of data, a lot of nuance, a lot of rapid ability to evaluate and discern that information. And really until now, with the burgeoning universe of AI and machine learning, we haven't had the ability or the global accessibility to even perform that much compute or to extract that much logic and make sense of it. And so now we have these sort of funny silos of lists, of collections of soft tissue biometrics, and of a growing practice around combining them. But each is not without its own challenges.
Sure.
With lists, we said earlier, what if they're not complete? What if the members in that ecosystem are trying to interact in a space outside that's not prepared to be able to verify that information? With soft tissue biometrics, being able to prove within a given constrained environment that you embody those biometric traits can be useful, but it's pretty limiting. Like, you can't rotate your eyeballs, for example. An associated key pair where your biometrics are an attribute.
Why would you need to rotate your eyeball?
I realized I jumped out with that pretty quickly. When we talk about key management, the ability for you to have a public-facing identifier, but to rotate the private keys behind it, basically changing your passwords.
It's like a flaw that you're pointing out with World, right? Like if they are basing their entire system on soft tissue from your iris, then you can't really have a private version and a public version because there's just one iris.
You forfeit consent and control over that identifier to an outside party.
Got it.
And so it is limiting in that, I think soft tissue biometrics are a really great username, but not a great password.
And so that's not what you use.
So we instead use what are called decentralized identifiers, or I refer to them as the data backpack, a public key with a private signing key that can be the subject of data. Data can describe it. So that data, instead of attributes, can include things like biometrics, which I think are very valuable, but they are only one part of all the information that makes you you.
But if I get your private key, can I pretend to be you?
I think being able to rotate private keys is very important. And I also think that the literal method of private key management that we see today, things like seed phrases, is
Right.
deeply flawed and limited. I'm sure many of your listeners have perhaps misplaced
what's
them
the
or
best
had
way
to
to do
change a
key
password.
management? Taking notes.
And so I think being able to use a combination of ways to prove your identity that back into traditional systems is the best step forward that we have. So being able to combine things like official documentation, soft tissue biometrics, and your data footprint is the most promising way forward. But again, there are limitations with each of these. And so we're still in the early stages of what that looks like in an ideal form.
Let's talk about how the way we're using the internet is changing. The examples that we walked through before are all reliant on this idea that I'm logging into apps. I'm logging into my banking app, I'm logging into Spotify, I'm logging into a store, I'm logging into a newspaper. But the truth is, increasingly, I've been interacting with the web through my cloud or whatever, Molt or whatever it is, right? And so I have something that's almost like a new intermediary between me and the web because the web got too enshittified. It was too annoying to browse it and play with it. And so now I'm just in this terminal with that cloud or that Molt, and I've given it my passwords, my information, and it's basically interacting with the web for me, interacting with apps for me, even simulating those apps themselves and rebuilding them where it makes sense to. And so I'm not really in this position anymore where I'm interacting with apps in that way, having this enshittified experience. How is identity changing in a world where people are finding a new high ground, a new high watermark at abstraction level above the web where maybe there aren't really apps anymore?
So I completely agree. And I think the data shows that your experience is not alone in a silo. The last quarter of last year, for example, about 1 in every 31 site visits was conducted by a non-human actor, which is up precipitously from 1 in 200 just earlier last year. And
Mhm.
so more and more of us are experiencing the web through the lens of our digital butlers, our AI enabled assistants. However, we are simply passing on the responsibility of identification to those agents. And so, in order to access spaces that are gated for adults only, in order to be able to facilitate payment, to be able to enable, access to, for example, government services that require you to identify yourselves, we are saddling our agents with the need to be able to prove who they're acting on behalf of if we want to be able to moderate the same types of experiences we could have in a more manual or old school way logging into everything. And so now I think we've moved beyond the era of simply KYC to what we're calling KYA, or know your agent. It's the ability to confer a unique identity upon an instance of an AI agent and to allow it to inherit or prove who it's acting on behalf of and their traits and capabilities.
And so that's really more of the use case than escaping the enshittification because we've already burrowed ourselves away from the enshittified experience. And so it's really just about um, it's about pairing the person with the agent.
So, agent or agents. In fact, I think, having armies of sub agents that are specialized for different tasks will get us to a better outcome. But to avoid the reshitification of the agentic internet, we need to equip our agents with some more data.
What about agents that aren't acting on anybody's behalf? Can they identify themselves too?
Certainly. So, I think, one of the unique and interesting ways that we often define agent identity is as a function of its controller or its deployer. So, as of yet,
But we're not going to control these little guys forever. We're going to set them free.
so enabling agents, for example, to deploy their own sub agents, I think introduces a really interesting and still open question. However, starting with an agent that was deployed by a human, there's a chain of command or a chain of children of inheritance. Right now, from a legal perspective, all of that still falls on the original deploying entity, even if emergent agency is created by non human actors in the middle. And so I think this is also where we back into regulation as one of the defining factors of how this will be permitted. But because right now there really does not exist a space for lawless or parentless agents because all of those deployments come back to a human being or an organization.
And so I have a question for you. Do you consider what you're building a frontier on the edge of technology and what's possible that technology enables? Or do you see it as a bit of a vine growing on the trellis of regulation, that you're building a technology that's allowing regulation to move into its next era?
I think it's impossible to be one or the other. We live in a society, there are rules, and we build at the frontier of technology in the reality and container that's defined by those rules. So it seems, I think, imprudent to ignore the existence of government entities or regulators when the consequences of the rules that they set forth can impact how we all live our lives and how businesses are able to operate within.
One of my favorite things about OG crypto was that we used to talk about exit and building systems that enable people, if they wish, to exit and live in a parallel system and escape from unwelcome authority. Is what you're building a tool that enables greater power to exit? or that enables greater control to prevent exit?
So I think of it as the only mechanism for exit. Right now, there is no physical, literal way for you to take custody of or create data without it immediately being handed over to a regulated enterprise. Save for writing in your notebook. But if we want to interact in digital space or take advantage of the benefits of decentralized technology, we are necessarily forfeiting most of our data into the hands of some other entity. And so the first act of independent interaction is to be able to sign on behalf of yourself and to fill the liminal space between you and counterparties with data before you elect to share it. I also think that the, interesting emergence of concepts like network states allow for a physical container or philosophical or social container for exit from the, traditional systems of government, but without the ability to hold data in those environments within their consent and control. It is a fun summer camp with no real feet to stand on.
All right. Well, live free or die.